Hey, it's Silver. This is Shattered Heaven. So this is actually something that I played the demo of a while back and wanted to, well, play the full thing. I was excited for the early access release to actually try the whole thing out, and it's here now, so here we are taking a look at it. And this is a party-based deck builder, but this is not a roguelite. If you lose on a mission, if you die, then you just have to do the mission again. You don't, start over from the beginning or anything. This is more of a linear narrative-focused kind of thing. This is going for a heavy story focus, which is unusual for a deck builder like this, but I'm a fan of that because I love RPGs of all flavors, and seeing a more linear narrative story-focused RPG in this form is really cool. So in this game you play a party of 3 characters. They're 3 set characters. You don't get to choose or customize them in any way at first, but you do have quite a bit of customization when it comes to their decks as well as their talent trees and stuff a little bit later on. And the way it works is you choose a dungeon to go into. There are various story dungeons as well as side mission dungeons that are shorter but often have some extra nice rewards for you to do. But you have to be careful about these because you can actually lock yourself out of them. More on that in a little bit. And once you're in the dungeon, it's like a big board game. Basically, it's a large board of different rooms for you to investigate, and every room could possibly have something, or it could be nothing, and you might just move on to the next room. And there are all kinds of different events that you can come across. So this is, very Slay the Spire inspired, obviously, in terms of how it works out, but instead of being multiple nodes on a map, each one having its own event, in this case, they are just a series of rooms on a big sort of dungeon overlay. And of all the various events you can find stuff like traps. For instance, traps are, of course, very nasty and will do damage to one of your 3 characters, but you have a chance to evade them if you want, and you can also use a trap disarm kit if you happen to have one of those to get a much higher chance of getting out of there unscathed. There are all sorts of different tools that you can have. These actually persist in between runs, so if you get a whole bunch of trap disarm kits in one dungeon and don't use any of them, then in the next dungeon you'll have all of them. And also, at the beginning of each dungeon, there are certain free tools that you'll be given just to help you out. Usually it's something like 1 or 2 disarm kits, maybe a protection tablet, some things like that. You get a couple of consumable tools as a bonus at the beginning of each dungeon. But while you're exploring, you can use some of these tools on the dungeon map to do things like reveal what the next few rooms are in every direction, or up your chances of getting particularly rare events, for instance. But some of the other tools are instead reactionary. They're things that you use on certain screens to try and get a better outcome. So like the trap disarm kits or the tablets of protection, because you can find these blasphemous events sometimes. They are usually events that have some sort of very negative outcome to them. That some of them have something that's kind of positive, but also something that's very negative usually. And they usually have multiple different choices for you to make, so you can kind of pick your poison. But if you have these tablets of protection, you can use one of those instead and just avoid making the choice at all. Although it's usually only roughly a 50% chance to actually do this, even with the tablets. So you don't have the best odds. And if you do end up failing this check, by the way, then you basically just choose one of the other 2 at random, so you don't get any choice. So you got to think about whether or not there's one of them that's really, really bad and one of them that's not too bad. So you'd rather just choose instead of potentially fail and have it automatically choose the worst one for you. But of course, eventually you're going to come across some battles inevitably, and the battle system in this game is pretty detailed and pretty nice, actually. Every character kind of has their own mechanics, which I really like. They took advantage of the fact that you're going to be playing 3 set characters and made them all completely different from each other, which I think was the right thing to do. So each character has their own sort of different resource that they can use in different ways, as well as their own set of active skills and their own decks of cards that you can customize at the hub area when you are not in a dungeon. So it's pretty limiting at first because you only have 2 AP, and most cards cost 1 AP, so basically each character can only play 2 cards on their turn most of the time. But you can, of course, up this with various cards that give you an AP back for something, or cards that give a different character an extra AP on their turn, so you can sort of use some of the resources of one character so that when a different one's turn comes up, they get some extra stuff they can do, and things like that. So you do have a good amount of flexibility later on when it comes to how to use this AP, but at first it can feel a little bit limiting when you only have the basic decks available. There are quite a few different keywords of various different kinds on a lot of these cards, and a lot of them are character specific. So each character has their own sort of list of possible stats effects and keywords and special interactions and things that they can use on each other. And the cards are split into gem types like Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Ruby cards are usually offensive cards of some kind. They're not always like outright attacks, but they oftentimes are. The blue cards, the sapphire cards, are usually defensive, something that gives you armor or something that gives you various defensive buffs like phalanx and things of that nature. And the emerald cards, the green ones, are usually like utility of some kind, so abilities, skills that activate at the beginning of the next turn, or things of that nature. And there are just a lot of different cards for each character. There are over 100 cards, I believe, total. So when it comes to kitting out each character, you have a fair amount of flexibility. And there are also these diamond cards, they're called, although honestly it looks more like an opal. And these are legendary rarity cards that are usually something very specific and very powerful for that character, and they're of course unique to each character as well. Your sort of main character, the main character of the story basically, Andara, she has this mechanic where every time she plays a card of each color, of each of the 3 main colors, it lights up this gauge. And if she does that 3 times in a battle, she gets this deify bonus where she becomes like partially deified basically, and gets super powerful and has a bunch of extra effects depending on her talent tree that can empower her in some way, but also she will have cards that say empower on them and they have some sort of extra effect below that. And those are cards that will spin the deity point that you've gotten in order to empower them for some sort of huge bonus. You've also got Magni, who is basically like your tank kind of character. He smacks people around with a shield and has all sorts of very powerful defensive effects that are super useful to have, including the ability to cover other characters when they get attacked, of course. So he's definitely a really good tank, and he gets these rage points when he uses offensive skills. And he actually spends these on his active skills, which makes him potentially very powerful, because usually every character's active skills, you can have 3 equipped at any given time, they're cooldown based, and they have quite long cooldowns at that, and they also don't get reset at the end of battle. The cooldowns will continue into the next battle, so you got to be a bit careful as to when you use them, but his don't have cooldowns at all, and instead use this rage resource, which allows him to use them much more often and a lot more freely. And then you've also got Ishana, who is like your caster sort of character, your relatively fragile character that has a ton of damage potential, and she's got a really interesting mechanic. She's actually my favorite character in the game, and she has this thirst mechanic. Basically, she's blind, but is not exactly possessed, but we'll say friends. She's friends with this horrifying eldritch ghost thing, and also may or may not be a cannibal, but that's a different topic. And the way that it works is certain cards will give you a thirst point in this gauge, and as long as you have at least 1 point, then the ghost will be summoned, and she'll actually be physically present next to the character in battle, which is a nice effect. And most of her cards have 2 different possible effects on them. One that if she uses it alone, and another one that will use up a point of thirst, but will actually do something extra as long as she has this ghost summoned. And they even have different animations and stuff to show the fact that the ghost is doing it instead of her. So she's very powerful, and also tends to have a lot of like power at a price cards, cards that do something negative but offer something very powerful in response. She has a lot of gouging mechanics, and gouge is like a temporary card removal from that battle, and she's also got a lot of like curse and bleeding effects and stuff, and in fact she even has some parts of her talent tree that allow her to drastically improve her bleeding effects to be much more damaging. So there's a lot of different options in battle. Every character also has an almost Estus-like healing system. You have a sort of healing powder that has 1 charge by default, and you can use that at any point in battle to do about a 50% heal, so it's a nice burst heal. And you can also equip various other things like trinkets that will improve various effects. Some of them are character specific, and you've also got different potions that you actually make yourself. And these can be offensive or defensive or curative or healing and all sorts of things depending on the different reagents that you use when creating them. There's actually quite an in-depth alchemy system in this game that allows you to use reagents and solvents in various different combinations to create all sorts of different potions of different strengths for you to take into battle with you. But yeah, all this comes together to mean that the combat is good in this game. It's very fun. It tends to last a fairly long time. Part of that is because the enemies have a good amount of health oftentimes, but I think another part of it is the way that the intent system works, which I'm honestly not a huge fan of in this game. You see, when Slay the Spire basically created the intent system, the idea was to tell the player what was coming next turn so that they could use their turn to prepare for it and actually come out unscathed or do whatever they needed to do to respond to it correctly. But the intent system in this game doesn't really do that, and instead it only gives you a very vague approximation of what's going to happen. So it'll tell you if an enemy is about to attack a character, but it won't tell you how much damage it's going to do, or if it's going to do anything else like a debuff or anything. It won't give you any of that information. An enemy will say when it's about to buff itself, but it won't tell you what the buff will actually do, or how long it'll last, or if it'll only buff that enemy or both enemies or what have you. It's odd. I'm not a huge fan of the way it works. I understand that it's definitely a choice that they made on purpose to not give you this information, and that's fine if that's the way they want it to work. work. I just don't really like it myself. I think the whole point of the intent system is to give you information that's actionable, that you can actually use to do something about. And in this case, because you're so limited and you can usually only play about 2 cards a turn, knowing how much damage an enemy does and therefore how much armor you need on a character for them to come out unscathed is really kind of important, because you don't really have a lot of room, a lot of wiggle room when it comes to using cards every turn. You're only going to be using 1 or 2 cards per turn most of the time. So it's sort of unfortunate, I think, that it works the way that it does. It's an odd choice for sure. It doesn't ruin the game by any means, but it definitely is strange to pretend like it's giving you useful information, but actually none of it really means anything on its own, because it's so vague that you don't really know what's actually going to happen next turn anyway. Although boss fights are completely the opposite, and in this game I think boss fights are where the combat shines the most. Boss fights usually have multiple gauges so that you know what the different phase transitions are, so each gauge will be 1 phase of the boss, usually have 3, so the bosses are definitely pretty complex, and they also have these various little symbols beneath their health gauge that show you various special effects that are going to happen, and these actually are detailed. Unlike the intention system, these tell you all the numbers that you need to know to prepare for what it is the boss does, which is important, and I'm glad they decided to give you that information. And also below the boss's health gauge will be some sort of special card that they can use, as well as some pips that show you the amount of charge towards using that card, and different bosses will charge this in different ways, and once it charges up to full, you know what it is they're going to do next. It's usually some sort of almost limit break level super powerful attack, or super dangerous buff, or something like that, something big and battle defining that you have to really prepare for, because you really don't want it to happen if you can help it. But back at the hub, you can do some of the other things that I mentioned, like, of course, the alchemy system, allowing you to use the various reagents and solvents you find throughout the dungeon exploration in order to create some new consumables. There's also bones, which are the currency, oddly enough, in this world, and you can spend bones in a shop to get various things like new materials, various finished potions, and even some new trinkets and things for your characters. You also have this altar where you can spend these dark bones that you get in from beating the adventures, usually. You can also, at the beginning of every dungeon, you'll get a choice of 3 different things that will make it harder but give you more dark bones as a reward, or you can choose to not do any of them and just get the normal base amount. I like this, and the fact that multi-floor dungeons have multiple choices allowing you to actually stack up increasingly difficult odds but better and better rewards is a really cool system. But yeah, you spend these dark bones at this altar to give you various sort of meta improvements to all your characters, like giving them more healing charges, or messing with the way deck building works and allowing them to get more cards of different rarities so that you can have more rare cards and fewer common cards or something like that. And all sorts of other bonuses. They're really nice to have, and they stack up to being very powerful, so you definitely want a lot of dark bones. You've also got the deck building itself, so every character has a deck of 20 cards by default, and there are various limits as to how many basics, how many commons, how many rares, how many legendaries, all that stuff that you can have, and that's one of the things the dark bones can alter. And I like that there are save slots, so you can actually save a combination of cards as a deck, and you can actually load different decks for different dungeons and stuff like that, so you don't have to constantly manually pick through every single one of them each time, one card at a time. You can actually save multiple decks and load them whenever you want, which is cool. And you've got the talent trees. Every time you complete an adventure, every character will get 1 talent to put into this skill tree, and this is one of the reasons why you want to do the side quests, because they also give you a talent. And these are awesome because the skill trees are pretty huge and have a whole bunch of different skills on them. So you've got stuff like just straight up stat increases, like extra maximum health or extra armor from cards, things of that nature. You've also got new active skills that you can put in those slots whenever you want. And you've got a whole bunch of powerful passive effects that improve them and their various card mechanics in all sorts of different ways. So yeah, every character has a pretty expansive skill tree, and this also works like the decks in that you can save a selection of skills in the skill tree, and then you can refund it for no cost and put in a different collection of skills for a different purpose and specialize it in a different direction and save that as a separate skill tree that you can load later. So you have a lot of customization when it comes to how your characters' decks and skill trees work, and the fact that you can save a whole bunch of separate ones for each of those and load them whenever you want is a really nice feature. As for the story and lore and voice acting and all that, it's actually really good. It's got this beautiful sort of gothic opera singing style to a lot of its, like, it's got a sort of a vocal track to a lot of its music and an operatic track, and it sounds really nice. All the music sounds very good in this game. It's very haunting and kind of sad, which is obviously the point. The world itself is kind of fascinating. It's a really sad world, very tragic, where basically the humans may or may not have killed a god, and he didn't like that very much. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on where basically humans are going extinct, and they have to have a vestal, a sort of vessel for holiness that takes the form of a woman who fights alongside this group of 2 guardians. That's why your party is 3 members. And there are 4 different sets of these 3 people that are all vying to be the one that helps humanity, and only one of them can survive. If any of them are left after the trials are done, then they actually have to fight each other to the death until only one of them remains. And that person will then have a baby and continue the lineage of humanity for their tribe, for their people. And the ones who did not do this, well, their tribes are probably going to go extinct and die out because they can't really have natural children in this world. People don't get pregnant anymore, and they also don't live past 40. As soon as you hit 40, you die. So, unfortunately, that means that humanity is in a pretty bad state, and there is a sort of reincarnation of the god, but he's in a child, and this child is very petulant and very mean and doesn't really care about much of anything and is just kind of going through the motions, basically, and it's clear that he has complete disdain for humanity and doesn't really care about the results of all this and really just wants to watch people fight and die for his amusement. So the story is sort of taking place in this really tragic but fascinating world where everything possible has gone wrong, and they're sort of trying to fix it but not really knowing how or what to do. And the various characters have some really good voice acting and a lot of voice acting as well, and the story scenes are really good. I'm not going to spoil any of that in the background, but there's actually some really good moments, some surprises and some twists, and a lot of intrigue and stuff that makes you want to learn more. And the game also has a really nice dictionary that adds a bunch of terms. Every time some sort of important story thing is revealed, then some more background information on what all that is will appear in the dictionary for you to go and take a look at on your own time if you want to, which is a really nice sort of lore touch. I like that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm definitely a fan of the story of this game, and I'm excited to see where it goes, because of course it is early access, so it's not all done, but what is currently here is a tragically fascinating story of a twisted, dark, sort of operatic world that I want to see resolve. I want to see more of the dungeons and more of the craziness happen and how it all ends. But, like I said, even if you're not into it for the story, the combat is actually plenty good enough to carry the game on its own. So if you're, not the kind of player that cares all that much about lore and stuff like that, you're more about just pure mechanics, the game has a very good combat system to carry you through. So, yeah, I would definitely recommend Shattered Heaven in its current state. It's a pretty exciting project, and the art and music and stuff is very beautiful and captivating, and the story is super interesting. So I'll link you in the description below this video to the Steam store page so that you can go and check it out on your own time. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.